Hello and welcome to the bookshelf brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. In this segment, we look at books that are important and pertinent to South Asia. I am Dr. Ronojoy Sen, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute. Today, we will be discussing Naoroji, Pioneer of Indian Nationalism, with its author, Dinyar Patel. Dinyar is Assistant Professor of History at the S.P. Jain Institute of Management and Research in Mumbai. Previously, he has taught in the Department of History at the University of South Carolina. He has a PhD in history from Harvard University. His biography of Dadabhai Naoroji was published by Harvard University Press in 2020 and is already being hailed as a classic. Thank you, Dinyar, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Ronojoy, for having me here.
Dinyar, let me begin with sort of one of the more obvious questions. Naoroji is known as the grand old man of India, but he's also unfortunately a largely forgotten and neglected figure. This is partly to do with what we call, and I'm quoting you, the dim view of early nationalism taken by many historians. And you must have been asked this question umpteen number of times. What made you decide to write a biography of Naoroji?
So that's a good way to start. I mean, Naoroji is just one of numerous figures who have largely been overlooked in Indian history, both in terms of the academic scholarship and popular works on Indian nationalism. A lot of the popular conception of nationalism, and even in academia, the conception of nationalism, it really starts with Gandhi or the Swadeshi movement. And both individuals involved in the Swadeshi movement and Gandhi himself acknowledged that there was a great foundation upon which they built their particular strategies and tactics. And that was, the so-called early phase of Indian nationalism, which really has its roots going back a long time. I mean, the people we associate with early nationalism were active as early as the 1850s. There's I think a great deal of need to focus on this so-called early phase. And the most towering figure in this early phase was, of course, Naoroji. And the interesting thing about Naoroji is that, there have been a few books written on him. There are about one or two which are relatively good in terms of providing an overview of his life, but they're very old. I mean, the last comprehensive book to be written on Dadabhai Naoroji was written in 1938. And a lot of the scholarship on early Indian nationalism gives kind of very marginal treatment to Naoroji. So that was the reason why I thought there was a great opportunity to look at this seminal, very foundational figure. A lot of people's popular understandings of Naoroji were again based on his book, Poverty and Un-British Rule. But there's much more to his life than just that book. The reason I decided to embark upon this project, first in grad school and later as my first book, was because there really wasn't that much information out there on him. And eventually, by the time I got to the National Archives in Delhi, where Naoroji's papers are kept, I discovered that there was this vast trove of material, about 32,000 documents, which had hardly been used by any professor. So it was a great opportunity to really do kind of groundbreaking work with material that hardly anyone had used before.
Right, yeah, that's a great point. One of the many things that I learned from your book was Naoroji's links to the princely states. He was also the Diwan or Prime Minister of Baroda briefly. Could you say a little bit about that phase of Naoroji's career, which is not really very well known even to historians?
Right. So even, as you said, amongst historians, the princely states are mostly dismissed as being these lackeys or tools of the British Raj, which, to a certain degree, they were, undoubtedly. Yet that story blows out a lot of, contrasts in this relationship between the Raj and these princely states. There was a time in the late 19th century where a group of princely states that were known as the more enlightened or progressive ones, actually really animated nationalist interest because there were rulers of states such as Mysore or Baroda, Gondal, Bhavnagar, elsewhere, which these individuals really embodied a lot of kind of progressive views on social and political reform. They created somewhat, the foundations of democratic institutions. Places like Mysore opened up a legislative assembly. Baroda started, education of all of its, its citizens, even venturing into compulsory education. There were state-sponsored attempts at industrialization. So early nationalists really latched onto princely states because they seemed to be in tune. These progressive states seem to be in tune with a lot of the ideas that they were thinking about and writing about. Baroda looms very large in the story, especially under Saiji Rao. But before Saiji Rao, there were a few Maharajas who had established a bit of a progressive bent. And so it was quite natural that in the early 1870s, Dadabhai Naoroji decided to take up an offer to become Diwan of Baroda and help implement reform, along with many of his other colleagues who were early nationalists from Bombay. They did a lot in the short period of time they were there. They overhauled the legal system. They overhauled the system of taxation for rural cultivators who had been overtaxed. They worked to cut down corruption. They streamlined the bureaucracy. But ultimately, it was, unfortunately, quite a failure because the Maharaja at this time, a man called Malharao, was, well, to put it gently, a little unstable. He was someone who, had a reputation for violence, corruption, and someone who was actually removed from power by the British just a few months after Naoroji tendered his resignation. Naoroji's experience in Baroda kind of threw light on both the opportunities and the limits that early nationalists had in princely states. I mean, there was great opportunity to show that Indians could manage affairs of state and contradict a lot of British stereotypical opinion about how Indians were not fit for self-governments. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it was the Maharaja who held the reins of power. And if that Maharaja did not have the best of intentions in mind, the whole experiment failed. It failed under Malharao. Under Saiji Rao, it experienced a greater degree of success. And not surprisingly, Saiji Rao and Naoroji became very good friends, and Saiji Rao supported Naoroji for the remainder of Naoroji's political career.
Thank you, Dinyar, for shedding light on the relatively unknown phase of Naoroji's political career. One of the stirring moments of Naoroji's very long political career was his narrow election in 1892 to the House of Commons from central Finsbury in London, which of course earned him the moniker of Dadabhai Narrow Majority because of the very narrow margin with which he won. What drove Naoroji to contest elections in the UK? And could you also say a little bit about Naoroji's role as what you term, and I'm quoting you here, as an Indian emissary in the heart of empire?
There was a long history of Indian interest in the British Parliament, largely stemming from the fact that Indians knew that they were quite powerless in India. So it was only logical to go to the one fount of power where they could potentially have a small voice, and that was Parliament. I mean, Parliament was ultimately in control of first the East India Company, the affairs of the East India Company, and eventually the British government of India. And within Parliament, Indians, going as far back to the to the time of the 1780s, 1770s, had found a few sympathetic voices in the British Parliament. And so Naoroji built upon that particular legacy. People like Rammohun Roy had gone and met with members of Parliament and had tried to lobby on behalf of Indian interests. And as early as Roy's time, Roy expressed interest in potentially entering Parliament, standing as a member of Parliament. There was a much longer history of this, and consequently, by the 1880s, a few Indians decide, why don't we try to stand for Parliament ourselves? And so the first person to do this was Lal Mohan Ghosh, who was from Calcutta, and he stood from Deptford in southeast England. He lost, but he came very, very close to winning. Surprisingly close. I mean, a matter of just a few hundred votes. And so once Ghosh had made his attempt, people like Naoroji decided that their time, had come as well to try. In the year 1886, there were 3 Indians standing for, or at least attempting to enter parliament. There was Lal Mohan Ghosh, who tried again from Deptford. There was Dadabhai Naoroji, and there was another Indian by the name of Nandalal Ghosh, no relation to Lal Mohan, who had tried to stand for parliament from Devon. In the west of England. He ultimately wasn't selected, but he had tried. So this was an idea that was catching on. And after Naoroji's attempt in 1886, many other Indians decided to throw their hat in the ring and attempt once more. So, you know, the idea of an Indian standing for parliament didn't come out of anywhere, didn't come out of thin air. And there was also a longer history of people from around the empire either standing for parliament or appointing representatives. You know, so Canada would have an unofficial representative in the British Parliament, Australia would as well. And so there was a need to have some sort of, you know, imperial voice in the British Parliament. Now, with relation to how Naoroji was kind of an unofficial emissary for India, you know, Naoroji wore many hats during his political career. And the one thing, you know, that he really tried to do throughout his lifetime was reduce British ignorance of Indian history and Indian economic and political affairs. So, you know, just as today, people have certain stereotypical attitudes of what India is like, and these tended to get in the way of, you know, the way people would think about things like Indian reform or India's fitness for self-government. And so what Naoroji would do was, you know, do a few things. First of all, he'd write a lot of literature talking about what India was like politically and economically, and specifically talking about the great deal of poverty in the country and why there was poverty and why the British Indian administration was causing that poverty. Secondly, he went after aggressively various people, racist bigots who, we're talking about how Indians were, inherently unfit for any form of, rights or self-government. And he established quite a track in the 1880s of having successfully, defeated many prominent British thinkers in debate halls and at the lecterns. And lastly, he acted as a personal conduit. So, even though there were these opinions of, who Indians were, and at this time, Indians were stereotyped as being corrupt, uncivilized, unfamiliar with the mores of civilization, Naoroji could stand as a living refutation of all these ideas and introduce Britons to many other of the hundreds of Indians in Great Britain who also could refute this idea. So over time, I think he really helped change English opinions about Indians as a people, and really helped create a great degree of friendship between people in England and the people in India, many of whom had never traveled to India themselves.
Yeah, quite fascinating. And he was also, as you write in your book, a sort of go-to person for many Indians in London, and also served as an inspiration to many of them, right?
Correct. So if any Indian ran into a problem, they would go to Naoroji. And the stories I found in the archives were oftentimes quite humorous. If an Indian would go bankrupt, they'd write to Naoroji and ask for a loan. I saw at least one or two instances of Indians asking Naoroji to bail them out of, a mental asylum, or, provide them with ship passage from Great Britain to India. And perhaps the most humorous example was I found a telegram written very early in the morning, maybe around like 1 o'clock in the morning, from a London police station just after New Year's Day, where a British constable had written to Naoroji saying that an Indian had been arrested for public drunkenness, probably had a little too much in celebration of New Year's, and he was asking Naoroji to bail him out of jail. Now, we don't know if that particular Indian even knew Naoroji, but he knew that Naoroji was an authority figure with whom, you could be in touch with whenever you got into trouble. And, whenever good things happened also, Indians were in touch with Naoroji. So when Indians passed the Indian Civil Service exam, or when they were admitted into Cambridge or Oxford, they'd go and meet with him, talk with him, get his advice. And oftentimes you'd have a mentorship type of relationship developing with many of these individuals.
Very interesting. To just move on, it is commonly held that the Gandhian phase of agitation and politics marked a decisive break with the so-called moderate politics of Naoroji. But Gandhi himself was an admirer of Naoroji, was he not?
Absolutely. now, Gandhi was someone who rarely said anything negative about anyone. So, one has to take his words of praise with a little bit of context and scrutiny. But certainly he was, quite reverential in many ways towards Naoroji and his legacy, as he was to people like Gokhale and others as well. And one or two things that Gandhi said really struck me. I mean, he said in Hind Swaraj that even though by this time, by 1910, 1909, 1910, even though many people no longer believed in Naoroji's particular brand of nationalism, which they thought of as being too moderate or too mendicant, they had to acknowledge that Naoroji provided the first few steps upon which the rest of the nationalist establishment could now build the edifice a little bit further. And towards the end of the Roundtable Conference in 1931, Gandhi told the man who eventually would become Naoroji's first biography, R.P. Masani, look, if Naoroji was around today, he was pretty confident that he would be following Gandhi's tactics rather than sticking to his own tactics, because Naoroji was someone whose ideas and political philosophies changed with time. I mean, this is very true for Gandhi. I mean, Gandhi evolved as a more progressive figure throughout his life, and Gandhi felt that Naoroji was of the same demeanor, in the sense that his politics became more progressive and more radical and more open-minded as he aged, in contradiction to the usual pattern of what humans go through, where we kind of shrink into ourselves and become more conservatives. Naoroji was someone who's going the other direction.
And that's a fascinating insight into the connections between Gandhi and Naoroji. And finally, to move slightly away from Naoroji, biographies as a genre have not been very common or popular in India. Do you see that trend changing?
Absolutely. Over the past decade, there have been a number of other biographies that have been published, or projects that are ongoing. I'm in touch with a few people who are doing biographies of a range of figures from the 19th and early 20th centuries. And people are now doing dissertations, which are biographical in scope. So I think that that change has definitely come. For the longest time, there's been kind of a reaction towards the idea of doing something like a biography in Indian history specifically. It was not thought to be politically correct, and you have the whole legacy of subaltern studies weighing on your head, which is fine and good. But one should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, there's a need for so-called elite history or life histories along with subaltern studies, and for that reason, I think our historiography has been much poorer. And luckily now we're being able to fill in the blanks slowly. So I personally have encouraged a lot of people to undertake biographical studies, and I think over the next few years you'll see some pretty important works come out.
Thank you, Dinyar, for sparing your time. We deeply appreciate it. And here is a copy of the book. You can see it. If you don't have a copy, please go ahead and buy or order a copy. I think it's essential reading for anyone who wants to understand Indian nationalism, and not just the early phase of Indian nationalism that Dadabhai Naoroji represented. If you wish to learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.mus.edu.sg. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me on.